Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polity's podcast. I am happy to be here with Eric Brende. Eric, thanks for coming on. I know very little about Eric besides what I've read from him in his book, which of course is a flattering portrait, as one might imagine. Eric wrote a book called Better Off back in 2005. No, four. Four. In which he documents his time living with the Amish, about 2 years, and life without technology, or rather, life without a good deal of machine technology. This was a long time ago, but this is my introduction to you, so I feel like I'm being warped into a future here to see you now. But thanks so much for coming on.
Sure.
So just to begin our discussion, what was it like living with the Amish?
Well, it was actually a lot better than I expected.
Yeah.
Which is funny for an idealist, because I went in there with very high hopes. And although I was gnawed by worry, because I had just gotten married, and our year with the Amish was kind of our honeymoon year.
Yeah.
We joined up. We didn't actually join the community, but we lived with these people starting about 10 days after our wedding.
Wow.
Straight out of Boston. My wife was an accountant in downtown Boston, and I was a graduate student at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
Not exactly the candidates for honeymoon with the Amish there. So what made you decide to do this?
Well, there's a sort of a short version of the story, and there's a long version of the story.
But the long version's in the book, so, you got to still sell this thing, I hope.
So, well, actually, going to say the long version is not in the book. I gave the short version in the book. There's an even longer version, since this is
change tax. Let's do the long version.
The short version that I gave in the book was essentially saying that technology is self-defeating. Our modern labor-saving technology does not save labor. It creates labor. It multiplies tasks, takes up more of our time, costs a lot, and ends up depriving us of time and leisure. And that was the case I made at the beginning of the book, using a series of kind of funny anecdotes from my childhood.
Yeah.
The story that I didn't tell in the book was that I actually got onto this idea from a Catholic Great Books program at a secular university, the University of Kansas, taught by 3 Catholic professors, even though it was a secular university. They kind of slipped in under the radar. Well,
Great Books has been the sleeper cell operation of the Catholic Church for decades. Now, I'm sorry to give it away here on this podcast, a very public platform, but it's the same at like Hillsdale. They keep wondering why all of their students turn out to be Catholic, even though they're a sort of...
It's happening at Wheaton College, too. Yeah. They have a more Catholic theology department, even though Catholics aren't allowed, than most Catholic universities.
So if you would like anyone to come to your university and start a literary and purely cultural view of the great texts of history, call New Polity.
So anyway, I took this Great Books program, and I ended up unexpectedly coming out of it both very pro-Catholic and very pro-Amish. I was not even Catholic before.
Oh, were you anything?
I was at that point in life, I was kind of an agnostic.
Sure.
I had been raised a cafeteria Protestant.
Sure.
But I came back, and it was to Christianity. And I also came to the conclusion that Christianity isn't even really believable without Catholicism.
Sure.
Because why would God send Jesus to the world just to create a hodgepodge of warring sects?
Yes. It seems inefficient, if nothing else.
So there had to be a better program. But anyway, that's kind of a digression.
Don't you think, though, that most people expecting an answer to the question of why you went out to live with the Amish would not expect to hear that it was because you had proclivities towards Catholicism?
No, yeah, that's why I didn't go into that in the book.
So why do you think that's still the case? I often find in reading the Catholic tradition that it seems to me like one giant critique of technology. Now, I grant we always read in our own, proclivities. But were you right then seeing Catholicism, the Catholic Church, as pushing you towards a desire to live without labor-saving devices?
I didn't get the idea directly from my own personal understanding of the Catholic tradition. I got it because the professors who taught the course were so talented at showing how modern technology goes against the Catholic tradition and goes against nature.
Right.
That was their main argument. It just goes against nature. If the purpose of a machine is to take away work from us, it's depriving of us of our purpose in life.
Right.
So then all we end up doing is having to go back and pick up the pieces of what technology took away for us. And that's the rabbit wheel we're all on right now. Technology takes, not only does it cost a lot, the sticker price and all the associated, the energy costs, and it also takes away from us oftentimes, or most of the time, the very end to which it's supposedly directed. It takes, it doesn't even achieve the end for which it was invented so often.
Can you give an example? I know you.
Well, like the automobile.
Yeah.
The automobile is supposed to get us from point A to point B faster. Mm-hmm. But by the time you factor in all of the costs, and then you factor in the social side effects, which is sprawl, we end up spending a lot more time in transit than we ever did before the invention of the automobile. So it doesn't save us time in transit at all. In fact, to me, I picture it this way. It's kind of like if you got into your car and you put down the accelerator and then you shot backwards. That's what a car is, like a backwards mobile.
Yes. Yeah, there's a brief moment in the development of new labor-saving technologies where it does work for the few people that have them, because it's relative to a world that hasn't been shaped in the image of that technology. But once...
Perhaps, but even for those people, if you read those are the people who try out things first. What's that? There's a phrase for that. It's like,
early adopters.
They're early adopters, but there's also a word, it's like the bleeding edge.
Ah, okay.
They suffer all the cuts and bruises testing out these things. And there's a wonderful vignette from the book Cheaper by the Dozen about this efficiency-minded father who has a dozen children because it's cheaper by the dozen, everything's cheaper. And he's an efficiency analyst in the early 20th century.
Yes.
He's also a car fanatic.
Yes.
Back before we had mass-produced cars. And the author of the book, who's his daughter, says he had a great love affair with this automobile, but his love was not requited because the car was always breaking down on the road. They would always drive 2 miles, and then the whole family would fit, and then they'd break down, and he'd have to get out there and crank it up and fix it. I mean, even the early adopters of the rich early adopters of the car were plagued by inefficiencies and breakdowns.
So you went to the Amish to try a life without labor-saving devices. And did you find that your idea holds good? Was labor saved? Was labor lost?
The book culminates in my time efficiency study that I sort of modeled on those old time efficiency experts, such as the protagonist in Cheaper by the Dozen. And I literally got out a stopwatch. And on the day of the hardest labor of the year, which is when we were threshing wheat, which is supposedly my grandfather told me about threshing wheat. And he said, when you threshed wheat, this is back in the northern Iowa farm that he grew up on, that's when you knew you were a man, when you could make it through a day threshing wheat. So I did a couple weeks of threshing with the Amish. And I paid attention to how we spent our time. And it turns out that the majority of the day was actually leisure time and pleasant things, because there were a lot of times when the wagon had to go back to the barn and you'd sit and talk before another horse-drawn wagon would come up.
Yeah.
Then if you count the fact that even while you're hoisting the sheaves of wheat up onto the wagon, you're oftentimes having a conversation.
Yeah, right.
And you're not even cognizant of the fact that you're working because you're too caught up in the talking.
Yeah, so this is something I noticed in your book, I remember especially you talked about picking beans, which is one of those laborious activities that we would hope, I suppose, machines would save us from. And something you noticed, something I've noticed, but I haven't put into words, and I really appreciate this, which is that the promise of machines is to automate certain tasks so that you don't have to do them. But this idea doesn't come from nowhere. It's in fact already a part of the human constitution, which is as we do a repetitive task, at first it is laborious, but as it becomes habitual and in our fingers and in our muscle memory and routine and rhythmic, almost musical, you start chugging along with a certain rhythm, the hands take on a certain independence and the mind is free. And typically it's free to converse. Mm-hmm. And as I was reading this, I was thinking, oh yeah, this is weeding, this is mulching, this is, honestly, it's picking up a playroom floor that's full of Legos. That's been a recent, you can get into that. And it seems to me that often the maintenance of a more heavy duty petroleum powered machine, say the lawnmower, I'm just thinking of like a walk behind mower, because I was doing this recently too. I only use things I've done in a week, like as my touchstones here. But the mind isn't quite freed. I mean, the activity, rather than being one of a repeated rhythm, is a maintenance of a loud, droning constancy, as it were, that actually seems to dull the mind from thought. And the way I sometimes practice this is by trying to say the rosary or Hail Marys during different kinds of work. And I find with most maintenance of sort of high-powered machinery, I start the same Hail Mary like 7 times before I finish it, because the mind is like, I don't know, it's hitting this like fuzzy wall that machine use seems to put up in front of repetitive labor.
Well, what's even more in conflict with the freeing of the mind is most of the high-tech jobs that people have today, where it does exactly the opposite of what we did on the farm. On the farm, our bodies were physically active and physically busy, thus freeing up the mind. Not only freeing up the mind, but actually establishing a kind of a pleasant rhythm that formed kind of a drumbeat for conversation. Mm-hmm. Which is what walking does, by the way. Aristotle, the nickname for Aristotle's school of philosophy was the Peripatetic school, because they would just walk around and talk. Mm-hmm. The walking stimulated conversation.
Oh, and it fills those awkward silences. Yeah. Or rather, the lack of walking or the lack of repetitive motion creates the first awkward silence.
Right, and then at a party, have you ever noticed that you kind of need to have finger food to give you something to do with your hands while you're talking? Because if you don't have something in your hands, you feel kind of naked.
Sure. And then if you're at a party and someone turns the music off, there's a sudden jolt of awareness that you were relying on a sort of quasi-activity to fill all your gaps. Yeah.
So in contrast to that model where you have the body, the physical activity, thus freeing up the mind, the typical white-collar job today is the opposite. The body is completely inert, and the mind is preoccupied with, I would call, very worldly, stressful kinds of mental processes that are not enriching to the mind. Or they might be, if you're a software developer, it might be like doing very elaborate crossword puzzles. So it's not raising the mind up to a higher level. It's just exercising the mind in its analytical functions, but not raising the mind. Mm-hmm.
Now, wouldn't someone viewing this without a positive sort of proclivity towards it, wouldn't a skeptic say something like, look, if you're sitting there waiting for the cart to get back, you might be enjoying your conversation or not, but from the perspective of an opportunity cost, you're losing. Namely, the whole point of a labor-saving device is to shorten the amount of time and the number of people that are necessary for it. So you may have a good conversation, but I, the skeptic, would keep that clock running because during that time that you're sitting waiting for the cart, you could have been investing in the stock market. I don't know.
Well, let me answer by way of a vignette from the book. This is a story that I borrowed from a Song of the Bird that I told the Amish crew while we were threshing. It's a story of a southern fisherman who is sitting by the water taking a break, and along comes a northern industrialist and takes a look at him, and he's appalled and accosts him and says, "What are you doing there? Just sitting doing nothing." I'm just taking a break." "Don't you know that if you were still out there working, you could catch more fish, and over time, without those extra fish you catch, you could afford to buy a second boat. And if you kept that up, pretty soon you'd have a whole fleet of boats, and then you'd be rich like me." And then the southern fisherman says, "Well, what would I do then?" And the industrialist says, "Well, then you could really enjoy life." And the fisherman says, "What do you think I'm doing right now?"
Yeah. No, it's true. I think there's a fundamental definition or description of work between I increasingly just think of them as like Catholics and sort of capitalists, but I know there's, that's a very broad camp for me, so you don't have to actually be like denominationally Catholic to be in my Catholic camp, nor do you have to be a denominational capitalist to be acting like one. So there's a different description of work at play, and it seems that where you have an idea that work is not perfecting of your nature, right? So where it is not enjoyable to do in itself because it fulfills the powers that you have by nature, then it becomes a kind of thing to do as little of as possible in order to get as much reward, right? And so, and even if you're spending all your time working, if it's within this mindset, it's still within this mindset of scarcity, this mindset of having to go through this in order to get something else. That view of work is always fraught with some vision of another place you'd rather be, another thing you'd rather be doing. The presence of easy conversation and pleasantry within human work seems to me to be a sign that the work is being valued in itself, for itself, and not simply as a means to some future end. And I think people know this. I mean, everyone loves to work. This is why, there's this weird disparate, there's this weird conflict between what we say we think and what we actually think. We say we don't like work, but people come on vacation and they can't stop working. It's like, we know we want to work, but we are worried about saying that it is in fact a good, that it is in fact what we want to do. Seems like your time with the Amish showed it to be showed it to be an end in itself and not just a means.
And I could also go on to add that it's not only for that reason that it's enjoyable, not just for the reason that they value the work for its own sake, but it's also because of how efficiently it weaves together all kinds of vital human functions.
Yeah.
Look at how much you're accomplishing if you're on the threshing crew. You're getting your bodily exercise, which you need to be healthy. You're out in nature, so most of the time it would be beautiful, maybe warm days, but beautiful days, sunshine, beautiful clouds going across the sky, beautiful landscape. So you get the beauty of nature. You get conversation, you get fellowship, and you're even in the process harvesting the food that you're going to be eating for supper or giving to your animals. And so it's a many-layered activity that's accomplishing many things at once. And in the typical work that people do today, they're in a cubicle that isolates that particular task from all the other layers that I experience. So it's very inefficient. It's a very inefficient use of time.
And I'd add something that I've experienced, and that's in your book, is you're raising children.
Yeah.
In work and not after work.
Yeah. the children are one of the crops you're raising.
Yeah, but what I mean is when, and I don't know about threshing in particular, but it seems to me that in most agricultural work, sans heavy, deadly machinery, there are lower level skilled tasks or lower strength tasks that children can and do, and in fact must take part in order for it to all work. Yeah. So then the work, just because it involves, I mean, this just seems to be a big problem we have in finding the wherewithal to obey the church's teaching on contraception, right? Is that within a society of alienated labor, children really are kind of useless. I mean,
they're economic liabilities instead of economic assets.
Totally. And I've mentioned this a million times. So this, for anyone who's regularly listened to this, just, you can just zone out. This is a rant I go on, but I was reading a bunch of papers from people trying to get better contraceptive use in Uganda, because they're just terribly inefficient at using contraception there. And so they're, these good, warm-hearted spreaders of the liberal gospel are going out there and saying, okay, how do we get them to make sure that they take Depo-Provera, that they take the pill, etc. And they concluded that one of the problems was when they spoke to these largely peasant communities about why they wanted more kids, the parents would say things like, well, to have many hands makes light work, right?
Yeah, that's what the Amish say.
Men are useful on the farm. More children are useful on the farm. And so you think this would be a learning moment, right, for the Western liberal to say, like, but it wasn't. It was a moment to say, well, then I see the barrier to contraceptive use. So what we need to promote is not just like propaganda about health. We need to promote urbanization and women's education. And by women's education, they meant basically the breakdown of the farming system, because it would mean having to have
so they're just
schools.
Basically thoughtlessly replicating our model of development on a country that they haven't taken any time to appreciate for its own sake.
And what it reveals about our country is that the reason that we have such a difficulty in saying yes to life, no to contraception, is at least in large part because we are living in a world in which children are not useful to the farm, and men, many hands do not make light work. They're just there, and you have to entertain them for 18 years. So it seems to me like the way you're describing the threshing day is that, or rather the part of the problem of the efficiency analysis is that it always begins from some premise of what work is being done. And if you go there and the work being done is that it is a, grain to cash transformation, and that's it. And so you're just measuring that output. Then you might say, hey, a guy on this machine is going to do a better job. But if you're measuring for more than this, if you're measuring at the human scale and saying, okay, here's education happening, here's fellowship happening, here's aesthetic beauty being received, here's a workout, right? I mean, it's funny, like we just divide all the things that used to belong to work and say, okay,
I have to do them at separate times and places.
The gym for the workout, daycare or school for the kids. Conversation, well, when the work's all done, I'll have everybody over for a drink, and then work. That goes in that box too.
It's very inefficient, and it invites the use of the automobile because everything's in a different time and place.
And it makes a lot more jobs for people that manage these types of things. I mean, this is why it's difficult, right? Because it's counterproductive in the true sense, because it's not just like it's an option to say, we're going to thresh in this way, or we're going to send our kids to school and work in that way, because you need teachers at the schools. You need, we
have a whole system that's in place, and we're part of that system. Right. It's hard to switch, and that's what leads me to the next segment of our conversation, which is how do you adapt the Amish way of life, or Amish principles at least, to a non-Amish context. And that's what I've spent the last 20 years doing and learning about.
Well, it always seemed to me that there was something, because people would talk like this, the Catholics should be more like the Amish. And it's like, well, but obviously there's a reason that we're not, right? Like there's a reason that the Amish seem to only be able to attain what they attain within a sort of isolated framework. Whereas the Catholic is always saying, like, if we're going to do something, it should be the whole world, right? It is not, it is literally a universal faith. It's for everyone. At the end of the day, everyone should become Catholic.
Right. It's hard to go to apprentice among the Amish without becoming Amish, either becoming Amish or leaving the Amish.
Yeah, sure.
And I sort of have kind of developed some strategies since then and the book I'm currently working on is trying to sample strategies all over the country, and different people are doing that will somehow achieve similar or the same goals, but without having to join the Amish or become a farmer.
Right, because even the Amish don't seem to be able to maintain being the Amish these days, it seems like.
Well, it depends on where you go.
Yeah.
Some areas are very commercialized and they've been swallowed up. Mm-hmm. And other Amish, like the group that I live with, is very successful. Mm-hmm. Very successful in maintaining a very strict regimen, a very low-tech regimen, and very high in its cohesion as a community. But they tend to pick good locations that are fairly remote. It's hard sometimes, like the Lancaster County area is been a victim of its own success, those Amish, because tourists flock there, and it's kind of like a circus.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But that's not the way it is with these other more remote communities. And by the way, the Amish are now in 27, 28 states.
Wow.
But back to the...
Yeah, so what are you doing to integrate this with non-Amish?
Well, I have this term that I don't know if it's my original term, that I would call householding. And the idea being that if you can integrate work and life at home, wherever you are, that is somehow the solution. And where I differ from, say, a lot of people who would want to take lessons from the Amish, such as even myself, is that the first thing to do is not to grow your own food. It's not about growing your own food. You have to analyze what's entangling us in the system, first of all, and know how to disentangle before you're going to be able to get anywhere. And I have my list of what I call the Big 10, which is short for the big tentacles. And at the top, you could argue about what order to put them in, but the worst ones are at the top of the list, and one of them is Big Bank. Another one is Big Med. Another one is Big Ed. Another one is Big Auto. And you go on down the list, and at the one that's least entangling us, the one that's giving us the most benefit for the least cost at the personal level is Big Agriculture, because we have such incredibly cheap food and it's so abundant. So to start out with, I would say don't move out to the land and grow your own food, because you're going to then be very reliant on Big Auto, which is much more entangling, the automobile. You're going to have to buy this farm, then you're going to be entangled with a big bank, you're going to have this big mortgage, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going in the wrong order. You're not going to get disentangled very easily. By living so counterintuitively, I'm finding that of all the places I've tried, the easiest place to live with less technology and live a more whole life is in the middle of a city where everything's walkable, bikeable. I live in urban St. Louis right now in a historic neighborhood. That helps. It's this beautiful historic architecture and tree-lined streets. And if you can find a place like that where there are a lot of rundown fixer-uppers, which there are in St. Louis, they're super abundant. They're actually giving away houses. Really? If you're willing to take their whole swaths of the north side have these tumble-down houses that needs people to come in and just take over. Yeah. If you can do that, then you get a house for next to nothing. You don't have to have a mortgage, so there you don't have to pay for your house twice and owe the big bank all that money. You also can walk or bike everywhere, so you don't have the cost of a car.
Yeah.
And you'll be healthier because you're walking and biking instead of riding in a car. So medical costs will go down. Your need for medical costs will go down, and so forth and so on. So paradoxically, it's the city, I think, that is the most promising place to go low tech.
Mm-hmm. No, I think I've seen this happen to many people, where the cash dependence in our society is so high that to move to the country and start eating a lot of peaches, as Sean Prine said, is usually means that someone within the homesteading family has a high-paying job that they're working remote or traveling to in order to take care of the cash needs, which of course, I don't know. I don't care. It's like I'm not a stickler for purity here. Like, if that's working for you, it's just that if the goal here is a kind of life in which our labor is not being expropriated and ruined for the sake of being divided into multiple commodity purchases, then merely moving off into the country, starting to grow food is not quite going to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, if you're working remotely in the country and you're supplementing your income on a computer, doesn't really matter that you're at home, because you might as well be a million miles away.
Oh, yeah.
It's not a kind of work that can engage your young children. And on
right.
the farm...
If all it took was actually being in the country, then presumably the people who are in the country would be as free and happy and independent as you're hoping for. But my experience of the American country right now is pretty much identical to American suburban life in terms of the actual habits of people. It's like, yeah, they're going out to operate, machines to do the agricultural work, but it's all Netflix and iPads at home,
And in the city, if you can economize to the extent that I did, you can afford the luxury of doing a craft trade for your income, which is what I did. I make most of my money from soap. I hand make soap and sell it at the local farmer's market. And I have a very good recipe, so I have a lot of loyal clientele. But it's a kind of a trade that the whole family can be involved in, because a lot of the parts of the tasks are very easy for children of any age to do. And they can see your parents or your father, they're working on it, so they it's something very concrete that's very intuitively understandable. So they get involved. So you don't even have to try to raise your kids consciously so much as you just do it, and it just happens naturally. Mm-hmm. And the testimony to the success of this is that my youngest son, who's now 25 years old, he went off to college, and he's a composer, he's a musician, and he loves to compose. And he was looking for a way to make money to support his composing habit. So he was recruited to work in a investment advising company. Mm-hmm. So he did that for a year and found it very stressful and not very rewarding. And then he, kind of on his own, he realized that making soap, like I did, would be a much better way to support his composing habit. So he came back home this past May and to apprentice for a week. So he really got all the tricks down. And now he's going off on his own as a soap maker, so that he can have the leisure time and the income to do what he really loves, which is composing music.
That's awesome.
And so it's nice to have that passed down. I feel like that's... he also got the music for me because I'm a musician. I mean, that was in his blood, because I was playing classical music at home a lot. I had a little musical group that rehearsed at home. So he grew up hearing that from the womb on, both classical and jazz and everything in between.
Yeah. But is this sort of ideal of a... I guess there's two questions. It seems like sometimes it can seem that the kind of sustainable urban existence has a certain parasitic nature to it on the things provided to it by a larger system that requires people to be in the kinds of jobs that we would obviously not like for ourselves, or to be. So for instance, it's like, okay, you're in a city, this is great, you can take the subway, for instance. But obviously, the kind of infrastructure within a city at that scale is supported by fuel consumption and by a entire world of alienated labor, etc.
Well, everything's relative. I would probably be tempted to argue that, relatively speaking, a dense urban area is a lot less exploitative than sprawling suburban areas.
Yeah.
So most people don't realize this, but the average New York City resident leaves 1/3 the environmental imprint of the average American.
Wow.
Because they don't drive cars and they're walking everywhere. The proximity makes it easier to keep heat or air conditioning in the buildings, so you don't lose very much to the outside air.
Mm-hmm.
Those kinds of benefits of proximity reduce the impact and the burden on everybody else. So that's one way to look at it. And the other way, there's another way to look at it too, is that no matter where you are, if you're living a whole life where you're doing a lot of little things that go together to become a householder and not dedicating yourself to the one thing, which is the career specialty.
Yeah.
And let's face it, most of the people listening to this podcast, if they went into a career, they're probably going to have a white collar career, or a career that depended on advanced education.
Yeah.
And that kind of career is the kind of career that assumes other people are doing the dirty work. But if you're leading a whole life, you rotate. So you're doing a lot of dirty tasks. They kind of intermittently go through a cycle of tasks that involve heavy, thankless work at times.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like digging, since I'm working on my own house, I had to dig a 3-foot trench from my house to my carriage house to lay new lines because I'm turning my carriage house into a guest house. Mm-hmm. And I did it myself, but that was pretty horrible, heavy work. And I procrastinated on that. Some of these things you'll procrastinate on. And I wonder about, there was a guy next door who's rehabbing his house. He's hiring people to do all that work. And they're out there. This is all they do all year long. Mm-hmm. Those people, they're digging in the dirt ditches all day long. And I kind of felt sorry for, I got in a conversation with them.
Yeah.
So I think if everybody lived like I did, where nobody would have to just do the thankless jobs, everyone would rotate and do some of the thankless jobs as part of their overall routine.
Yeah, that is definitely an experience of fixing up a house. I mean, it's unfortunate sometimes that by the time you get good at a particular task, you're done for 10 years or so. But I hope that it sticks.
That is, yeah, it's, there are limits to living. There are some things, you're just going to delegate. There's some things you delegate because you can't do it all. And that's always been true. I mean, people have been carpenters or stonemasons, or there's a certain degree of specialization down through time.
But there is something horrid about the idea of working a job that you hate just for money, to be able to then delegate all of the tasks of your life to other people. Like, there's something that seems very limiting to the human spirit there. That we really are capable of quite a lot, and our hands want to work. I mean, we're embodied creatures. We want to learn, we want to get good at things.
And oftentimes the supposedly thankless jobs are actually healthy, like digging the ditch. It was good aerobic workout, good for my muscles. And I wasn't used to doing that kind of work, so it was heavy, but it was healthy too. But I wouldn't want to do it all day long every day.
No, I get that. Yeah. Now there's a term, functional fitness, that people bandy about, and it's a trend within gyms where they do things that imitate work in order to work out certain muscles. So you're hammering or you're digging, or and
Why not just hammer and dig?
Right, not hammer and dig, right, exactly. You could get paid while doing it, get paid to go to the gym.
That's why one thing I did do that a lot of people would think maybe would be thankless work, but it wasn't at all, was I drove a pedicab for 15 years in St. Louis. A pedicab is a pedal-powered rickshaw. It looks like a little chariot. It's a little fiberglass chariot that's pulled by a kind of a bicycle.
Yeah.
And it was a great way to get paid to stay in shape.
Yeah.
I felt like every year I did it, I got a year younger.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it was fun because you'd have conversations with the passengers. You'd take them to the baseball game.
Well, I think it's hard to convince people that more work is better. Not more of the same work, not more of work you hate, but a willingness to be the agent of change, the agent of causality in your world, to say, I'm going to take this on and not farm it out to anyone. I think it's very difficult because I think we are kind of educated to believe that only expertise should handle each compartmentalized part of the world. And it's part of an industrial workplace training, and it's part of school, frankly. I remember in school taking tests where they showed what job you were suited for because you took this test. And it's that similar idea of there's a fear that of our own power, really. Like there's a fear that we really are capable of learning and accomplishing each task. And so we'd rather just find one thing to become an expert of so that we can hire the experts of other things. And this is a hard vision for me to break.
But what you're, I think you put your finger on it when you said we have a fear of this, because it's a fear-based. We're afraid of our own powers. But the human being is by nature omnivorous or omnicompetent. And all we have to do is dive in and do it. It does help to get coaching. It does help to get training. I myself took a course at the Shelter Institute in Bath, Maine that really opened my eyes to all the principles of home building and remodeling and everything that I would need to know. And that has served me very well in the last 30 years, or 25 years, or however many years it is. You yourself here are starting a college, which is aiming to do something similar to get people used to working with their hands and being practical.
And one of the things Aristotle says about the hands is that they are fitting for an intellectual creature, because just as the intellect is open to an infinity of, it's infinitely open. So the hand can take on an infinite number of shapes, basically.
Oh, that's a very interesting.
The body.
Where's that passage?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Is that in the Politics?
It's almost certainly in the Politics. In my head, it's actually, I'm thinking of when Aquinas cites it. He cites it in, question. No, I don't know.
But Aristotle is kind of a fraught example because he kind of also says the opposite in the Politics. He says basically, if only the looms would weave by themselves, then the slaves would go free.
Well, Aristotle's not a Christian, right? Like at the end of the day, he couldn't conceive of the political life actually being extended to everyone. He couldn't conceive of social order without slavery. And Christianity didn't rid the world of slavery by accident. It is true that until you have the particular revelation of Christianity, that it does seem kind of like nature to imagine that not everyone can fulfill the capacities that are apparent in the hand or in the head.
That's very apparent if you read some of the, they're novel. I've recently read two different novelized versions of life in ancient Rome, historical nonfiction, one by Robert Graves and one by Robert Harris. And it's very, how it depicts slavery in such an interesting way that nobody could conceive of there not being slavery. Slavery, I mean, that would be trying to conceive of today, for people to conceive of a world without cars and dishwashers and televisions. Well, I mean, they were just there. They're part of the furniture, and you had to have them.
Well, yeah, Ivan Illich makes this point. He says that the question is not how to do without machines. The question is how to do without slaves. Our reliance on machine technology is quite literally a reliance on slavery.
Mechanical slaves,
mechanical slaves physically, and then a reliance on unseen sources of production whereby we get the machines, feel the machines, use the machines, right?
Yeah, sure. It's the same mentality, and also results in a lot of the same dilemmas because it was expensive to own a lot of slaves. And so similar, it's very expensive to own and care for a lot of machines.
Yeah.
That's why a lot of families can't afford to have more than 2 children because there's so many mouths to feed other than their children.
Right. Yeah, and it does seem that sometimes when we advocate for a life with less, there can be the idea that it's this life with less. What I mean is you're going to keep all of the goods that you get from basically a cash-based machine operating society. You're just going to sort of get them differently. And I find that this is not quite true. What I mean is like there's a real poverty involved in saying no to a particular machine to get the job done. It's just that it's enriching your life as a whole usually, but there is like particular, how do I put it? I had to build a
discipline. You have a discipline where you fast for the sake of a greater good.
Yeah, I mean, when I was building a wall, I was choosing to do it with my hands. There was suffering involved in that. It wasn't like machines just fooled everyone, because really there's a way of doing it with your hands where you use as little energy as you would driving a backhoe. It's like, no, you do actually risk yourself more. You hurt yourself more on some level. You work more and you work harder to get the job done. The question is not, the problem is one in which we compare the goods of a life that doesn't rely on industrial machinery directly to the goods of a life that does. The wall is a good example to what we were speaking about earlier, because immediately I found that I couldn't do it alone, which is not an experience you necessarily have when you're operating machines. So there's no like built-in need for society when you do most of your labor through the operation of machines. And because of this, you miss out on the goods of conversation, the goods of helping others. And so I guess all I'm saying is that it is hard because it's also a experience of conversion. You're not just moving from one machine to a new type of work that replaces the machine one-to-one. You're moving from someone who has a individual mindset of getting the job done through purchasing the commodity and using it, to getting the job done through creating a social sphere in which we're all getting along and making sure that we're working together, et cetera, et cetera. It just seems like there's more of a sacrifice to move from one to the other than I think sometimes people are willing to admit.
Yeah, I mean, another way to put it is there's a steep learning curve.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah. There is a steep learning curve. Although I would say that it's not as steep as that. I mean, it's not as steep as, you're going to be toiling and building rock walls. Mm-hmm. I think the first steep learning curve is to realize, I mean, for me, I get to go back to the thing I started out with the beginning, is that if you really want to disengage from the capitalist industrial system, you have to get rid of the image of the cabin in the woods with, like Laura Ingalls Wilder, and you're going to go off there and get away from it all. Because that really presupposes the automobile. It presupposes all kinds of things that won't disentangle you at all. You'd just be even more entangled, maybe.
Yeah.
And it's that mental adjustment that might be the steepest part of learning curve. Moving to an inner city like St. Louis, to a neighborhood where you can afford to buy houses, that if on a limited budget, that means you're going to be living in a kind of a gritty neighborhood.
Yeah.
You're going to be living a little bit on the edge. You're going to be having to swap the idea that the suburban life is safe because I have my totally self-enclosed world and I get it everywhere in my tank that we call a car, to a place where you feel more exposed and more vulnerable, and then you're at the mercy of neighbors. And that's the kind of mental adjustment that I think would be the most daunting for a lot of people. In fact, it does turn out that for somebody like me, who's not a member of a gang in an inner city, slum, which there aren't any close to my house, but there are some in St. Louis, it's actually a lot safer to live in the city than in the country, because in the country you spend so much more time in your car, and so you're much more likely to die randomly in a car accident than you are to be killed randomly by a mugger.
Sure.
I mean, it's shocking. It happens once in a while in St. Louis. Maybe once a year there's a shocking mugging where somebody is killed, and it's not a gangland thing, maybe once a year. But every day in the St. Louis metro area, some person dies in a car accident on average.
Right.
And that's not, nobody takes that into account. And most of it is in the suburbia, because that's where most of the people are driving.
Yeah, it makes sense. Ivan Illich said that wealth in a society of counterproductivity, so a society in which the engagement of labor-saving devices as a constant form of life actually is laborious and done constantly, and makes for more labor for everyone. He says in this kind of society, you're going to know the wealthy, the elite, by virtue of their ability to not have to access goods through the system.
Like the owner of Walmart doesn't have to drive to Walmart to get his stuff.
Exactly. Or, the same people in California who've been pushing for getting their, touchpad technology or touchscreen technologies into public schools as the mechanism for learning themselves, they send their kids to Montessori schools where they're touching wood,
and they won't
blocks,
let their kids
on screens. Or
they've publicly admitted that.
Oh yeah. Jeff Bezos is a big Montessori man.
That's
or something. You can see a trend. I was just reading Matthew Crawford's Why We Drive, and he sees a trend, which seems likely to me that it's going to occur on a larger scale, which is basically like as cars and driving becomes more and more of an automated, capital-intensive task, where you're sort of pushing a button and, everything up to the self-driving car is the sort of future for driving. Precisely at the same time, all of the values and virtues of old cars and sort of, very direct controlled driving, stick shifting down, this beautiful image of the sports car that's on the open road kind of thing, that this will become the province of the people who are wealthy enough to be able to afford not to have to drive the cars that are basically neutered versions of what once was.
And, maybe the crowning example might be that oftentimes the dream of retirement of a CEO who's finally made, his 200 million or whatever he's amassed, is to finally be able to go out in the country and raise cattle and live a leisurely life like the yeoman of yore.
Yeah, right, exactly. And that goes back to the idea that it takes a certain amount of capital to live like a peasant now.
Yeah.
Whereas to be a peasant now is precisely to be divorced from any productive property, most especially the land. All of which is to ask, like, is this just a boutique game? Is this something that, or maybe I should be specific, is the movement towards a life without heavy use of machine-powered technology something that is really capable of being everyone's life in a gradated fashion, or is it something that is available just to a certain socioeconomic class that can afford it within a system where everything else is necessary wage labor, driving a lot of cars, making sure you have a phone so you can text your boss, that sort of thing?
I think, in the abstract, yes. Practically speaking, it would be hard if there's a number of conditions that would have to be in place. People like me would also have to support other people like me economically. So if I make handmade soap and walk or bike everywhere, but then I do all my shopping at Save-A-Lot or Walmart or Home Depot, then I'm not doing anything to reciprocate what the people who are buying my soap are doing. So I'm not doing anything to help other people. So I think you have to bear that in mind. I mean, yes, to some extent, you're going to have to not be a purist and like, I will buy toilet paper at Save-A-Lot. I mean, but there's no toilet paper stand at the farmer's market, so I don't feel guilty about that. But I try to buy my vegetables, if I do buy vegetables that I don't grow, at the local farmer's market. And I think that's only fair. So, but if you do it, so that's one condition. You have to, put your money where your mouth is. And then another condition, of course, would be our system is to a huge extent a reflection of the laws of the society that we live in and the regulations even at the local level. So those regulations can foster a better way of life or discourage it depending on what they are. So it will help to be active in your neighborhood association or whatever level of government where sometimes these issues come up, like bike paths. If biking is kind of a luxury in St. Louis, or it's viewed as kind of something for the few, partly because we don't have nearly as an extensive a bike network as some cities. Like the best city I've heard in the country is Davis, California, or San Luis Obispo, California, two cities that have just interlacing bicycle paths everywhere. You don't even have to ever bike on the street. St. Louis could be like that, and I'm trying to actually get a task force together there's some places that just cry out for a bicycle pedestrian bridge over the railroad tracks that would connect North and South St. Louis, connect our neighborhoods.
Sure.
That would make a huge difference. So infrastructure really matters. Political activity to a certain extent matters.
Yeah, I was thinking of the laws regulating houses. So what constitutes a house, where the desire to live without a certain reliance on, say, electricity or heat through electricity or natural gas is practically illegal. I mean, you can't build a house and heat it with a wood stove in my city, for instance.
Seriously, what city is that?
Steubenville.
Steubenville.
Yeah.
You cannot heat a house with a wood stove in Steubenville?
You cannot. No, let me. That's right. You can have a wood stove, but it can't. You have to have another form of. Heat.
It can't be. You have to have a backup furnace.
And I also presume that. I don't know this to be the case, but I doubt you could build any kind of house without a main line out to the sewer.
Doubtless. Yeah, there's a lot of regulations like that. I will say that wouldn't be just the, if you had to take out a loan, the mortgage company wouldn't let you build a house without a furnace.
Right, that might be more the...
So there are a lot of reasons why that wouldn't happen.
Right.
So, yeah, and that some neighborhood associations don't allow people to hang up their laundry in the backyard.
That's true.
There was a really funny little cartoon I saw one time with a picture of a woman hanging up her laundry in the backyard, and then there's a police car over at the edge on the street, and the policeman is saying through the megaphone, "Step away from the clothesline." So that can, I mean, some neighborhoods are really uppity. I had sometimes, I mean, people think, oh, if you move in the city, you're going to have problems with neighbors. But you can have worse problems. The worst problems are suburban neighbors because there's so much more not in my backyard attitude. Or there's so much more divorced from the land and what it takes. I had a friend who lived in one of the most expensive neighborhoods of an inner suburb of St. Louis called University City, and he was on the most expensive street. And all he wanted to do was grow a garden in his backyard. He couldn't get it. He couldn't do it.
Really?
And the reason was that in order to do it, well, there were a lot of big oak trees. And this created two issues at once. It created a lot of shade and a lot of squirrels.
Yeah.
And so he found a sunny place in his backyard, and he was able to put in the garden, but the squirrels were getting everything. So then he took to getting these benign squirrel traps. And he found out where he lived, he could put the squirrels to death by drowning them in the squirrel trap.
Oh.
But the word got out that he was doing this in the neighborhood, and he became anathema. And there was a gynecologist across the way from him who came up to him and said, and he was a Jew, and he said, "Don't you know that squirrels are God's creatures?"
Oh my!
So they ended up moving. Now they're in a high-rise condo. They just gave it up completely.
My gosh, that's terrifying. Yeah, we've got a law here. It's a weird one where you can't have a vegetable garden in your front yard.
Oh, really?
It has to be in the backyard. And this leads to problems. Sometimes the shade in the backyard isn't convenient in the front yard. It's the big part or something like that.
That is silly.
But you chase these laws down, and it's funny because it's not really, I mean, we want to phrase, sometimes I want to phrase it like this, centralized power, bad, like small neighborly association, good. But almost always when there's a bad law within the sort of centralized regime, it's because of some neighborly conflict, and you find out like the reason no one can have a vegetable garden in their front yard is because a neighbor complained about a certain house growing squash, didn't think it was sightly, and so it became law.
I don't think that's true in St. Louis, and I know it's not true in Denver because I have a cousin who grows a huge vegetable garden completely surrounding her house in urban Denver.
Yeah.
So that's not everywhere.
No, definitely not. But I do know what you mean. There is a use and abuse of city code that can make a life that's less reliant on technology.
Yeah. Like whether they allow chickens, whether in St. Louis they have a law that you can have up to 4 animals, but they bar hooved animals except for horses. So you could have horses. You could have 4 horses.
You could have horses
in the city of St. Louis because everybody used to. They had they took horses to pull their carriages.
Right.
So that law has never been removed. You could have 4 horses, but you can't have 4 cows. You can't have 4 pigs. You can't have 4 sheep. You can't have 4 goats.
Right.
But you can have chickens.
Can you have any goats?
You can't have any hooved animals.
Yeah. We can have 2 goats here.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, 2 goats. You can have 2 pigs. But there's a lot of, this is what I wonder about city law. We're getting a little far afield here. But I wonder if there's no mention of the animal. Can you just try it out? Like, there's nothing in our law about sheep.
There's not a rule against it. I would say for your neighbor's sake, you want to do something that won't be too outrageous.
Well, right. And urban sort of gardening has this limitation where people, imagine the animals that they can keep, but then they end up buying feed for them in a way that's just makes them as reliant on cash as they were before.
Yeah. That's one reason why I'm not into animals. I just didn't want to have chickens and pay for the feed. And then when the chickens run out of, bugs to eat in your backyard, they're going to have feed. There's only so many bugs available to eat.
We've been keeping them on compost pretty well. They don't
really?
They don't really need a lot of supplement. buy a bag of feed usually in the winter. That about does it.
Okay.
Give it a shot.
All right. Maybe I should do it. I'll have to consult you afterward.
All right. So your final word for the listeners' new polity. Why should they consider a life of less machine use and more leisure, I suppose?
Why should they consider a life of less machine use and more leisure? Well, you've already answered the question.
I know, it was a softball.
In the question itself is phrased. Because it's self-evidently desirable. If it's true of what I'm claiming, then it's self-evident. If you intelligently choose technology, and I use the principle of what I call minimation, which is minimizing the amount of automation. Doesn't mean the automation is necessarily a small amount. It might be a large amount, but it's just the minimum that you need to achieve your goals, because technology always brings a cost. And no matter what it is, it's some kind of cost. And it will get in the way of the very goal you're trying to achieve. So if you can do that, if you can find a more direct, more holistic way, and it could be an organizational solution, it could be a lifestyle solution. Usually that's a better choice than just buying a machine.
Mm-hmm. And I think cost analysis really requires reflection on who we are and what we need to thrive and flourish. And I think this is why so often there's this tie between a reluctance to jump all into machine use and Catholicism and really Christianity considered more generally, which is that it's precisely when people are really confronting a decisive claim about what makes life good. Like, what do you need? You need love, communion. You need the Lord in your life. You need freedom from slavery and tyranny, freedom from sin. And you have this vision. Precisely then, you have the framework by which any particular task is never going to be adequately judged on the basis of costs of just time and money alone. Right? Because everything you ask, you have to ask, am I fulfilling the goal of becoming holy? Am I fulfilling the goal of my vocation as a father? Am I fulfilling the goal of practicing contemplation within my work? Am I fulfilling the goal of offering up my sufferings? Things like this, I think, tend the religious person towards these kinds of views. I don't think it's an accident. But being willing to provide total cost analysis and not partial cost analysis, I think is what's most fundamental. Because if we try to just say, okay, I'm gonna figure out clever ways of throwing my body into something as opposed to a machine, and then just delighting in this certain feeling of purity that can come with not being involved with machines, I think that's only going to take us so far. But if we can say, okay, what goods do I want out of life? Who do I want to be? And then, like you say, at what point does a machine stop fulfilling that goal and start to work against it? Well, then let's cut out use there, which, as I understand, is kind of what the Amish do, I think, at least traditionally, when they discuss.
The more intelligent Amish will have more intelligent solutions. I think the communities can vary on how intelligent their politics is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But what you're saying, another way to say it is the very word economics comes from the word household management, oikonomia in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
And so this gets me back to my original point, is the best way to be economical is to have a household-based economy. And those cost-benefit analysis become much more apparent, the solutions, if you do that.
Yeah. All right, Eric, Brende, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're happy to have you on the podcast. We will see everyone next time. Goodbye.